Hey guys, it's me Jack and I'm back with another review. Well guys, this is it. The most hated Spider-Man movie of all time. What some people would even consider to be one of the worst comic book movies of all time. The Amazing Spider-Man 2. After the success of the first Amazing Spider-Man, Sony figured that they had another franchise under their belt. So in 2014, they released the sequel. There was a fair amount of anticipation leading up to it. But when it was released, people hated it. There was so much hate for the movie that all future sequels and spin-offs that were planned were cancelled. And 2 years later, Andrew Garfield was replaced by Tom Holland. In the years since this movie's release, it has been criticized and slammed by pretty much everybody. It's safe to say that it was basically Spider-Man 3 all over again, except people thought it was even worse. So, do I think it's really as bad as all that? Well, let's find out. The plot of this movie centers around Peter Parker, who's balancing his life as Spider-Man and his normal life. He's still debating with himself whether or not he should date Gwen Stacy, as he does want to keep her safe. He's also trying to figure out more about the mystery surrounding his parents' disappearance. Meanwhile, a Spider-Man fanboy and outcast named Max Dillon is turned into a supervillain named Electro, and Spider-Man has to stop him. And meanwhile, Peter's old friend Harry Osborn comes back and realizes that he's dying, and the only thing that can save him is Spider-Man's blood, but Peter doesn't know if it will work or not. This causes a rift in their friendship. So yeah, just like Spider-Man 3, there is a lot going on in this movie, and that is one of its major problems. And like Spider-Man 3, none of these stories really connect, leading to a very fragmented story overall. The way that the movie transitions back and forth between the different stories is also very choppy. After he fights Electro in Times Square, Peter comes home and then just out of the blue starts trying to find information about his parents' disappearance, to the tune of Gone, Gone, Gone by Philip Phillips, which, as everybody has said, is a completely unfitting song for this scene. I think it's a good song on its own. But this scene should have had some more of that investigation-type music from the first movie. Then, in the next scene, Peter is trying to fix his web shooters so that Electro doesn't fry them. And in the next scene, he's talking to Harry about his disease. Like Spider-Man 3, this movie definitely would have been better had it been 2 movies. And seeing how they had future sequels planned, they could have easily just put some of this stuff into those movies. At least with Spider-Man 3, Tobey Maguire signed on for a 3-movie contract. So Raimi knew that a 4th movie with Maguire could possibly not happen. But this is the 2nd movie, so they could have easily taken some of these subplots and put them in the next film. How are the characters? Well, I gotta say, I still love Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man. You can tell that he's having a lot of fun in this role. Something that I really like about his portrayal of Spider-Man is the way that he interacts with the people. At the beginning of the movie, he saves Max Dillon. Max is someone who's been shit on all his life, and feels like a complete loser. Peter, knowing how this feels, comforts him, telling him that he's not a nobody, he's a somebody. There's also the scene where he saves a young kid from bullies. Again, Peter knows what it's like to be bullied. Not to mention, this kid is into science just like he is, as he built a little wind turbine, which Peter fixes for him. But he's great in the scenes where he isn't Spider-Man as well. In my opinion, most of his comedic moments are gold. From the scene where he takes out a bunch of guards so that Gwen can escape Oscorp, the scene where he tries to explain to Aunt May why his face is dirty, and even some of his jokes that he tells at the beginning of the movie are pretty funny as well. This does lead into another problem, however. As many fans have said, in the opening scene of this movie, Spider-Man spends more time telling jokes than he does, actually saving people. Granted, telling jokes is part of Spider-Man's character, but he usually does that while he's saving people. Here he just takes a break from it to tell a couple of them to the Rhino. And yeah, I can understand why a lot of fans would be pissed off about this. But Garfield still delivers an incredible performance. His dramatic moments are very impactful, like the scene where he tells Gwen why they can't be together, or the scene where Aunt May tells him that she was told that his father was a criminal. And of course, that scene at the end. You know the one I'm talking about. I'll talk more about that later. Nonetheless, Garfield I think is great in this movie. We have the return of Gwen Stacy as well. This movie kind of retcons the ending of the last movie, where Peter and Gwen got back together. In this film, they break up early on. I understand why they did this. Again, a lot of people thought that Peter was a dick for breaking his promise that he made to Gwen's father, to stay away from her. As I stated in my previous review, I really didn't think it was that bad, and I thought it was understandable why Peter did this. It was what Gwen wanted. Nonetheless, the chemistry between them is still great. Like the last movie, she is shown to be a very strong and independent character. Especially at the end when she essentially saves the day, turning the power back on and destroying Electro. Of course, after this, she's killed. This is something that a lot of people didn't like. A lot of people felt that it was too early to kill her off. I thought that this was just the perfect time to kill her off. We had 2 movies to enjoy her and her relationship with Peter. And seeing it continue in a 3rd movie would just feel like too much. It would just be more of the same stuff, like it was in the Raimi movies. And because her character was so great, it makes her death all the more tragic. If this were Mary Jane from the Raimi movies, I wouldn't have given a shit. But because it's Gwen from these movies, I did. Of course, we have to talk about the villains. Starting with Electro, or Max Dillon, played by Jamie Foxx. Max is an Oscorp employee who gets shit on and bullied all the time. He has no friends at all. Then one day, he's saved by Spider-Man, and this leads him into becoming obsessed with Spider-Man. There's a very sad scene where he's alone in his house, pretending like he's talking to Spider-Man, showing just how lonely he is. His best friend is a guy that he barely even knows. All his character wants is to be appreciated, which is something that I think a lot of people can relate to. We want to be seen as somebody. We want to make some sort of impact on this world. We don't just want to be seen as another person. Even more so, we don't want to be treated like crap. I think Jamie Foxx did an excellent job here. Because when you think of a nerdy loser type character, Jamie Foxx is not the type of guy that you would think of. But with this character, I honestly bought it. Then he becomes Electro, and much like the Lizard in the first movie, he becomes a lot less interesting. Granted, I think the design is very cool, with all the electricity flowing through his veins. But the biggest problem is his transformation. It's so sudden and so rushed. He goes down to Times Square and then gets shot at by the police. Spider-Man shows up and tries to calm him down. Spider-Man forgets Max's name, and Max naturally is kind of annoyed about this. Max is eventually shot at, and everybody starts cheering Spider-Man on and calling Max a freak. Now, it's completely understandable why Max would want to attack the people, but it's very unclear why he suddenly turns on Spider-Man. He says that he set him up and that he lied to him, but how? His reason for disliking Spider-Man is very confusing. Later in the movie, during the final battle, he says to Spider-Man, "Do you see me now, Spider-Man?" But he was the only person who ever saw you in the first place, so how does that make sense? He is still very intimidating though, and I could take him seriously for the most part. A lot of people complain about his one-liners and how they're cheesy, but this is a Spider-Man movie. The Spider-Man movies have some pretty cheesy dialogue, and it's a lot like the comic books, so it doesn't really bother me. We also have Harry Osborn, played by Dane DeHaan. Peter and Harry were best friends when they were kids, and then Harry's father, Norman, sent him off to boarding school. Suddenly, years later, Harry is brought back home right before his father dies. His father tells him that he's going to die soon as well, unless he finds a cure. And he also has to run the company now. Harry Osborn in this movie, I think, is a very solid character. Like Max Dillon, he's very sympathetic. He's a kid who was thrown away like he was nothing by his father, and then brought home and told that he's going to die, and that he has to run a whole company. This puts a lot of pressure on him. The relationship between him and Peter I thought was very believable, and the film did a very good job of making me believe that these were 2 old friends being reunited. There's a nice little montage of the 2 of them talking about the things that they did while they were apart all these years. And we learn that they do have some things in common, mainly the fact that their fathers left them at a young age. But where Peter was at least raised by parent figures in the form of his aunt and uncle, Harry was not. When he finds out that Spider-Man's blood could possibly save him, he asks Peter to get Spider-Man to give it to him. Being Spider-Man, Peter is naturally very conflicted about this, as his blood could kill him or do something worse, like make him go crazy. In the end, he can't bring himself to give Harry his blood, which makes Harry resent him and feel betrayed. Harry is then framed for a cover-up and kicked out of Oscorp. This leads him into breaking into the prison where Electro is and releasing the villain. The two of them team up for revenge on Spider-Man, and Harry eventually ends up getting the spider venom, which, surprise surprise, makes him go crazy, and that's when he truly becomes a villain. I gotta say, I think that this is a very well done villain origin, especially considering that it's all done in one movie. The Raimi trilogy had 2 whole movies to turn Harry into a villain. This movie only had 1. And yet despite that, I didn't feel that it was rushed. His motivation was easy to grasp. Again, the only real problem is when he actually becomes the villain. I mean, look at this! Just look at it! This is such a stupid design. I mean, the Power Rangers suit was stupid, but at least it looked like the Green Goblin. This looks like a guy in amateur Gollum makeup. And Dane DeHaan's acting in this scene is really bad. He's trying to do this over-the-top, crazy performance, kind of similar to the one that Willem Dafoe did, and it really doesn't work. It's too goofy. And like Venom in Spider-Man 3, he only gets a little bit of screen time as the actual Green Goblin. However, unlike Venom in Spider-Man 3, they at least kept him alive for the next movie, even though it didn't end up happening. I really would have liked to have seen more of this Green Goblin. If they just improved his design and didn't make it so stupid, I think he could have been a really good villain. Nonetheless, his origin was very good. There's also Paul Giamatti as the Rhino. Another criticism that this movie gets is that it has 3 villains just like Spider-Man 3. And I gotta say, I don't get it. This movie has 2 villains, Electro and Harry. Rhino is just some guy that shows up at the beginning and the end of the movie. It's kind of like saying The Incredibles has too many villains because it has the Underminer. He's just some guy to show up at the beginning to give us an opening action scene, and then show up again at the end to set up the sequel. Anyway, I thought for the limited screen time that he got, he was alright. He served his purpose fine. The rest of the characters aren't much to talk about. What about the multiple storylines in this movie? As I said before, this movie does suffer from having too many subplots. The one subplot that I definitely could have done without was the Peter's parents subplot. It should have been resolved in the first movie. That way we could have focused on some of these other characters a bit more. Not to mention, it doesn't really lead anywhere in this movie. The ultimate resolution of it is that he finds out that his father wasn't a criminal. That's it. Granted, Andrew Garfield's performance when he finds this out is amazing. Again, showing just how great an actor he really is. But it still really should have been cut. Peter also finds something else out. He finds out that the blood that Peter's father put into the spider venom was his own. So yeah, the only reason that Peter has all these powers is because he's a Parker. And this really doesn't work. It goes against the whole idea of Spider-Man. The idea of Spider-Man was that he could be anybody. Anybody who was bitten by a radioactive spider and got these powers. But here, no, it was just destiny. Only a Parker can become Spider-Man. Everybody else will become that. There's this opening scene at the beginning of the movie that shows Peter's parents fighting an assassin on a plane, which ultimately results in their death. And it feels like such an out-of-place way to begin the movie. Also, as much as I do love his character, Harry really could have been cut out of this movie as well. Especially when you watch the making of and you find out that the only real reason he was in this movie was so he could become the Green Goblin and kill Gwen. But was this all really that necessary? Couldn't you just have Electro be the one that kills her? I get that they want to be true to the comics, but if that's the case, why isn't it at the Brooklyn Bridge? And why does the Green Goblin look like this? I'm sorry, I haven't gotten over that yet. I feel like if Harry and the Peter's parents storyline were cut out, this would have been a stronger movie. It could have been a nice simple story about Peter going through relationship troubles with Gwen, while also fighting a fanboy turned enemy. But no, we got all this stuff crammed into one movie. The action in this movie is pretty entertaining. The opening chase scene is a lot of fun. And the fight between Spider-Man and Electro in Times Square, while short, does get in some truly amazing slow motion shots. And it really puts you into the mind of Spider-Man, using his spider sense to save people. Some of the visuals in these action scenes are quite stunning, with all the blue electricity caused by Electro. And the final fight between Spider-Man and the Goblin is also very good, and very suspenseful as well, all culminating with the death of Gwen. The special effects in the film are pretty impressive for the most part. In typical Spider-Man fashion, there are times where it can look a bit video game-like, but it's still a lot better than the Raimi movies. And the scenes of him swinging around in the city are even better in this film than in the last. Another complaint that this movie gets a lot is that it's nothing but a setup for future movies. And again, I really don't get it. Sure, there are scenes and moments that do set up future movies, like the scenes with the Rhino and the Sinister Six equipment at the end. But these are very brief moments. They're not the entire movie. And the Marvel movies do this a lot as well. Look at Captain America Civil War. What purpose does Spider-Man serve being in that movie? None other than just setting up Spider-Man Homecoming. He shows up, fights with the heroes for a bit, and then f***s off. The soundtrack for this movie was done by Hans Zimmer, with some contributions from Pharrell Williams. Interesting choice. But I'll be perfectly honest, I really like this soundtrack. It has its own unique feel, and is definitely a step up from the soundtrack of the last movie. No disrespect to James Horner, but this soundtrack has a lot more of its own identity. I know a lot of people don't like the electro music, and I understand. Dubstep is a very weird type of music to use for your villain. But he is an electric-powered being, so it makes sense. And while his motivations are still not totally clear, the music does really help me invest in his character. Especially in the scene where Harry comes to free him, saying the exact same thing that Spider-Man said to him, "I need you," which is exactly what he always wanted, and the way the music builds up as he manages to escape and help Harry. It's a moment that almost has me cheering for him, even though he's the bad guy. I don't really know how to feel about the rhythmical whispering. During some of these scenes, we'll hear a little voice sort of singing about the thoughts that are going through Max's head. I think I enjoy this a little bit more than I should. So yeah, this movie is a pretty mixed bag in quality. Usually in my reviews I talk about the good things first, and I talk about the bad things later. But this movie is just such a mix in quality that I just couldn't do that. But if I'm being perfectly honest, overall, I do still like this movie. It has a lot of problems, and I understand why people don't like it. But I think there's a lot of really good stuff in this movie that, at least for me, makes up for its shortcomings. Andrew Garfield's performance alone makes both of these movies worthwhile in my book. I think it's very appropriate that these movies were called The Amazing Spider-Man, because while the movies themselves aren't amazing, Andrew Garfield's performance as Spider-Man, in my opinion, is. I was legitimately disappointed when they cancelled the future sequels. I wanted to see more of this world. I wanted to see more of this interpretation of the character. I wanted to see where they were going to go with Harry Osborn. And while I do love Tom Holland's portrayal of Spider-Man and the movies that he's in, I can't help but watch them with a little bit of sadness, because I really miss Andrew. If you don't like The Amazing Spider-Man 2, I completely understand. But for me, it's still an entertaining watch. I'm gonna give The Amazing Spider-Man 2 a 7 out of 10. So thanks for watching this video, and join me next time for my review of Spider-Man Homecoming. Till then, I'm Jack, and I will see you next time.